Okay, so we've got x, and notice x is a global variable. Why is it global? I'm hearing it from a bunch of people. It's outside of any function. So what is the scope of this variable? The entire program. Uh, that means if I've got something down in here in any of my functions, let's just do one here. Let's write a prototype up here. Void print name, and we'll send that a string. Okay, so we got that prototype, and here I'll say string name equals Homer. And then I'll call that function. Okay, so I'm just declaring a string, putting Homer in there, and then I'm going to call this function called print name with my string. Okay, so I've got void print name string name. Oh. It's void, so I don't need a return statement. I'm not returning anything. We good so far? All right, nothing out of the ordinary. And I'll come up here to main, and I'll say, before I even call this function now, here on line 12, I'm saying cout x equals x. Now I'm going to copy that line of code, and I'm going to put it on line 14 also. Now y'all, this is a 20-line program. We good so far? All right, let's run it. Control F5. And here's my results. Does this bother anybody? It should. What did I just do to my very important number? I had a function change it because I accidentally didn't declare. Look what happened. Down here, I just used X. The compiler didn't complain because why? Because it's global. That means it exists. The compiler says, I'll use it if you want me to. And by putting it through that loop, I changed its value from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And that stopped the loop. I just trashed out my global variable that I wanted for something else. That's the huge danger, is any function in your program can accidentally trash out that global variable. See, with local variables, that doesn't happen. Why? Yeah, they're in that function. The function can't accidentally trash it out from someplace else. That's the huge danger. Also, let's suppose this isn't a 20-line program, but it's a 20,000 line program. And I've got some global variable floating around up there. And now that my program doesn't work right. And now I'm going to try and figure out why. Imagine debugging 20,000 lines of code to discover, oh, I've trashed out my global variable down here. Plus, another programmer looking at this, suppose this is a long program, and they're looking at that function right there, and they're going, wait a minute, you never declared X. Why is that working? It makes it really hard to figure out what a program's doing when you use global variables. So in short, unless you can justify it, and by the way, it makes my program easier to write, it's not a justification. Unless you could give me a really, really, really good reason why you're using a global variable, just don't. Just don't. If you go on in programming, you'll get to some stuff called object-oriented programming, and the things you're using in there look like global variables, but they're not. So just don't use global variables. But now the book contrasts that with global constants. Why is it okay to use global constants? Yeah, they can't change. There's no danger of accidentally changing them because they're constants. Okay, that was one thing. Now then, let's get to the static thing, because that is the weirdest thing I think you read about, maybe, unless it was the default parameters. So let's look at the static. By the way, I haven't done it in Blackboard yet, but let's make the written and the lab assignment due by this coming Tuesday night at midnight. That'll give you some breathing room, because it's one thing, I mean, this is Friday and we're talking about this stuff, and yet I'm expecting you to use some of this in your stuff that you're going to turn in by Sunday or by Saturday if you want to get it in early. So let's make it Tuesday. It's due. Monday will be the early day, if that works for y'all. You're welcome. All right, so we've got, let's change this up just a little bit. Maybe I want to keep track. Maybe I want to keep track of how many times this function has been called. I'm going to take out my global variable up here, by the way. So I could do this, right? I could say int counter equals 0. I just want to keep track of how many times this thing has been called. And when the function ends, I just say counter plus plus. That's one little change. And another little change is I don't want this to be void anymore. I want it to return an int. So this counter is just to keep track. Like that. And so then I'm going to return the counter. Okay, nothing just out of the ordinary here. Notice X has a squiggly because it hadn't been defined yet once I took my global variable out. Okay, so I'm setting the counter to 0 when this function is called. I print the name out 10 times, and then I add 1 to the counter and I return it. So that means up here in main, I'll take that line of code out, and I will declare a variable to hold the counter. I'll just call it C so that you don't think that it is, that the name has anything special going on here. X no longer exists. So this now is returning a number. So I'll say C equals the number it sends back. And I probably need to close that off, don't I? Okay, so when I run this once, what's C going to be? I do have to change this prototype. Okay, so when I run this, what's going to happen? Follow the logic. It's going to call this function. The function is going to print the name out 10 times, and it's going to return what? 1. You're right. And so it should say C is now 1. So let's run it. Hey, there it is. Just like we thought. Okay, so I'm going to end that. I'm going to do something similar here. I'm going to do the same kind of thing. I'm going to copy these 2 lines of code. I'm going to paste them a couple of times. So I'm calling that function 3 times. What should the last one be printing out? C is now what? Let's see. No pun intended. Tough crowd. Boy. Notice it's saying 1 every time. How would I make it? The problem is this. What's counter's lifetime? Only in the function. That means once the function ends and I call this function again, it's reset to 0. Unless I put the word static in front of it. If you see the difference, it'll make more sense. Now the lifetime of counter is not just in this function. It's more like a global variable's lifetime in that it'll last the whole program. So if I run it now look what it's saying. The first time it says 1, the second time it says 2, third time it says 3, just like we'd want it to. Now, you're not going to use static variables very often. You're just not, because you don't need them that often. But when you need them, it's sort of like a pickup truck. You better have one. By putting the word static there, you're saying don't just let its little lifetime be for this function. Make it for the whole program. And there'll be some times you really need to do that. I don't know. Devaning, that answer your question about it? So looking at it up here, does it help answer your question? The problem is, it's not really a problem most of the time, the lifetime of a local variable like counter is only while that function's running. What happens when the function's not running? It gets thrown out. Just like yesterday's news. Well, the next time you call that function, what happens? It gets set to 0 again, unless we put the word static in front of it, and then it just keeps it running total. Okay? Like I said, you're not going to use it very often. Questions about that, y'all? Well, you didn't do it right. Well, let's pull yours up and see if we can debug it. Did you get it yet? Do what? Brenna, did you figure it out? You just don't want us to look at your code is what it is. Okay. All right. All right. Anybody have a question? Anybody have a question? Okay, let's look at default parameters then. Let's say I change this up again. And I put string up here. And I put equals Bart. Now look what I'm saying. I'm saying if they don't enter anything as a parameter, or as an argument, I should say, the book calls these default arguments. You'll hear people say they're default parameters. They mean the same thing. All right. If I don't put Homer here, if I do put Homer here, it's going to look just like it did. Watch. I'm running it. It's printing out Homer, 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 just like it did before. But what happens if I put Bart here, or don't put anything here? And here I put Marge. See, I can put a constant in there, a literal, and here I put Lisa. I'll just put name here, just like we had before. Now follow what's going to happen. Here, I'm saying print out Marge 10 times. Here, I'm not putting anything as an argument. So what happens? It defaults to Bart. You're saying if I don't put anything, do this for me. It's sort of like the Miranda warning. You can get your own lawyer. If you don't get one, I'll appoint one for you. And here, I'm appointing Bart to be the string that gets printed out. Down here, I'm sending name, which is Homer. So when I run this, watch what happens. And notice our counter's still working because it's got static in front of it. So default arguments just let you specify what's going to be there if the user, who is another programmer in this case, doesn't put anything. All right, let's try another one, unless somebody has a question. Or is this just so clear it just leaps off the screen and you go, oh my gosh, that's clear. All right, let's do this then. Let's scrap this. I'm just going to comment it out. Actually, you'll be able to see this video, so I don't have to do that. Let's say I'm returning a double, and we'll call it area. And I've got int. So I'm going to get the area of some figure here. And I'm going to just take this out. And I say int base. See, I'm not asking the user for anything. It's just going to waste our time for this purpose. I'll say the base is 12 and the height is 5. I'm writing main first, so I'll say I need a double here. Double. Let's change the name of our function to triangle area. Because I want just a little variable called area here. And I'll say area equals triangle area. And I'm going to send it base and height. Okay, simple little program. I'm writing main first. I need to probably throw this away. Okay. Double. Triangle area. Now I've got to give these names here. So I could call them B and H if I want to. I could call them base and height. As long as you know that the names I'm using down here are not dependent on the names up there in main. So I can say return what? Base times height divided by 2. Divide by 2.0 because those other things are ints. Now I could have a local variable here to save the area, or I can just do this. Your call. And because these are all on the same level of order of operations, I really don't need the parentheses, but we get used to putting them. Okay, so I'll run that. It says the area is 30. Now, is that right? 5 times 12 is 60, divided by 2, that's 30. So we're good. All right, let's try something else. What if I put default parameters and I said if they don't enter anything, let's make the base 20 and the height 100. And I'm going to copy this. Only this time I'm not putting anything in the parentheses. So this time it should say the area is 30 again. 20 times 100 is what? 2,000 divided by 2. So the area should be 1,000 on this second one from the default parameters. It is. Okay, makes sense? What if I just wanted one of these? What's the rule here? Which one? Like if I make this one default, do I have to make this one default, or is it vice versa? See, I don't have to make them both default. Will the compiler let me do this? And just make the first one default? It doesn't seem to be liking that a whole lot. What's it saying here? Default argument not at end of parameter list. Oh, so I can make this one not default and make this one default to say 60 or 90. Compiler's happy with that, so I can do this a third time down here. Now notice, by doing this, I've got to have one number in there. I can no longer get away with what I did on line 14. Please check out line 14. The compiler might gripe at me for that. Let's see. It's not liking something. What's it saying? Come down here and look at my errors. Yeah, not enough parameters. Okay, so I can't do that anymore, but I can do, I could say 4. Now what's that mean? It means that the base is going to be 4, the height is going to default to 90. So I should get an area of what, 180? 4 times 90 is 360 divided by 2. That's what it does. So I can have all my parameters default. If I don't want all of them to be default, I've got to start out here at the right hand end for my default ones. I can't start at the left hand end. And I sure can't put them in the middle someplace if I've got 3 or more. Stop right there. Anybody have a question on the reading that we didn't talk about so much yesterday or today? Because right here, notice this parameter is not default, that int, so I had to put a number for it. The other one's default, so I could either put a number like I did up here, or if I leave it out, then it's a 90 automatically. Anybody? Question? Question about any of this function stuff? We are nearing the end of it. We've got one more day to talk about functions. That's going to be next Monday. We've spent a long time on functions because they're important. Real important. And next chapter is our last one. Dun 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 dun. Anybody? Question? Okay. All right. Then let's spend the rest of the class. We got what? Yeah, we got almost 20 minutes. Why don't you start working on the assignments for this coming week?